It's that time of year, everybody. The time that I so enjoy and look forward to every single fall. If you're new here, you may be asking yourself, what makes this time of year so special? Well, I'm glad you asked. Every year, most years, since 2017, quite by accident, I have been embracing that womanly need to dig up the past by flexing my archaeological props just a bit in service of taking an aspect of the incessant outrage culture of the intersectionality crowd who so revel in keeping all things culture segregated and flipping the concept on its head. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, lizard people of all ages, my name is Weebo Jones, and this is the Halloweeb Special. So in 2017, we discussed cultural appropriation and proved the quite improbable standard of originality one holds mundane objects, styles, etc. to when stereotype associating them to culture. We did this by searching the archaeological records for an alternative culture who'd done it first. In 2018, I kind of dropped the ball. You did not get a Halloweeb special. Sorry, not sorry. I didn't realize that this was going to be an annual thing until 2019 or 2020 thereabouts. So in 2019, we returned to the Halloweeb Special and revisited the topic of cultural appropriation, proving absolute hypocrisy in the case of one of the biggest arguments against cultural appropriation, that being revisionism. We did this by examining the swastika, its cultural origins, and its modern-day recharacterization by the mainstream media and others in the form of exclusively Nazi associations for the previous 10 months of that current year, so 2019. Moving on to 2020, I don't know what I was thinking this year with the black and white filter, but we branched out from the topic of specifically cultural appropriation with a pushback on the big-brained take that slavery is an original sin, unique to only white people or cultures, by giving an incomplete history of slavery across the entire globe. In 2021, we lightened up the conversation by bagging on those TikTok folk obsessed with moralizing over their cultures not being a costume, a phenomena that exclusively rears its ugly head, or not exclusively, but predominantly rears its ugly head just around this time of year for, well, reasons. This year, we're going to examine some famous relics from antiquity, their provenance, the real intention behind the whole concept of the preservation of ancient artifacts, and introduce some much-needed nuance into the conversation as a whole. And in order to have this discussion about provenance, we need to understand what I mean when I speak about provenance. Provenance has two definitions that are relevant for our purposes today, that being the place of origin or earliest known history of something, or a record of ownership of a work of art or antiquity used as a guide to authenticity or quality. Now, one of these is a more layman's take on the understanding of provenance. One is a more academic definition. Both can be valid depending on the context. In the early days of archaeology, people played fast and loose with provenance. I don't think it would be a stretch to say that a lot of archaeology is bordering on grave robbery. I think there's like a joke out there about archaeologists and the difference between them and grave robbers being only about 50 years. And it's kind of true. But the difference between then and now was that back then there wasn't really an established methodology for how to conduct archaeological digs and research. In fact, as of the late mid-19th century, archaeology was largely regarded as an amateur pastime by most scholars of the day. Much of what archaeology is to this day is owed to those aspiring amateurs back in the mid-19th century who very much took advantage of the British colonial empire and its wide range of opportunities for excavations of antiquities and sites from those cultures that had been colonialized. And as a result of all of that archaeology during the prime of the empire, we come to find that the British Museum today gets a lot of flack for having historical artifacts within its walls with, questionable provenance.
1897 had a show of looting in the Benin Kingdom of Edo State, Nigeria. The British tried to expand their trade, so they sent an armed expedition to destroy the palace, capture the king, and take away so many sculptures made from wood, ivory, and brass.
To even think for a moment that her musty, crusty, colonizing head is worthy of the regalness of the Kohinoor. Look at her. Camilla Parker Bow Wow. Someone needs to tie a bone around her neck instead. Give her shit back.
This is an ancient Egyptian cosmetic spoon from around the 18th dynasty.
There is a lot of Egyptians in your comment section telling you to address certain things in your video, but I don't think you clearly understand the scope of where they're coming from. See, we all know the history of many places around the world. We all know what it was founded on. And we all know that most of the artifacts originate from those history of those countries, are not even displayed within those countries. They're displayed in museums that it's not even the original country where those artifacts come from.
Emma Chamberlain wearing a Cartier necklace that was stolen from the Maharaja of Patiala is both incredibly disappointing and ironically very on theme, but I'm glad people are talking about it because it addresses a much larger conversation that we should be having about stolen artifacts in the Western world. This also includes items that were won by force or acquired unfairly, many of which reside at the Met Museum itself. All throughout history, especially during the colonial period, powerful empires and nations took culturally significant artifacts and valuables from the places they conquered, most of which have never been returned and are now held in Western museums or belong to greedy rich people like this New York billionaire who had over $70 million worth of stolen artifacts, most of which passed through trafficking networks before he acquired them.
The British Museum is home to tens of thousands of stolen cultural artifacts. As minorities who are indirectly affected by it, should we storm the building by force, or get over it and grow up? Those are your two options. It's a binary choice.
I think we say we're going to get over it and grow up, and then at night, when at least expecting it, we storm the building.
That's the best reboot of Night in a Museum ever.
There seems to be this prevailing conclusion in online spaces that the absolute worst fate a cultural artifact could have suffered is landing in the hands of the British during the height of its imperialism. But that's neither here nor there. It has ascended into meme status for the British at this point. And I can understand the hate vibe. By no means was the British Empire a virtuous entity. This is hardly a unique trait to the British, however. They weren't the only ones to colonialize, they were just the best at it. And so as a result, they happen to be the most prevalent recipients of the backlash that I can find when it comes to historical artifacts and provenance. But trust me when I say there are worse offenders out there. To give you a recent example,
Egyptians call for the return of the Rosetta Stone and other ancient artifacts. Thousands of Egyptians are demanding the repatriation of the Rosetta Stone from the British Museum back to its home country. The latest campaign to reclaim the antiquities has gathered more than 2,500 signatures in an online petition launched by a group of prominent archaeologists. Together, these archaeologists urge Egyptian Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli to work through diplomatic and legal means to retrieve the antiquities.
It's more of a symbol than it's just the historical significance of the stone. يعني لأنه the stone is a symbol of cultural violence, the stone is a symbol of cultural imperialism. So restituting the stone is a symbol of changing things that were no longer in the 19th century, but we're working with an ethical code of the 21st century. This is the first time there is actually a public involvement in pushing the state to act on behalf of the people, that it's not just a request from the government, it's a request from the people. And now we're planning for spending enough time collecting signatures and raising awareness, because I think the primary point is that we want to tell Egyptians what has been taken from them. I'm sure all these objects eventually are going to be restituted because the ethical code of museums is changing. It's just a matter of when, in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years, in 5 years, and who will have the courage to take such a decision, who will be able to correct the mistakes of history and who will, of course, choose to stay on the colonialist, imperialist side. I think it's a telling situation.
So we have that. But I'm here to tell you that when it comes to historical artifacts and ownership, it is far more complicated than you originally thought. Let's begin by examining the Rosetta Stone in question and its provenance. It's probably the most famous hunk of rock in history, if we ignore certain bodybuilding Johnsons more famous these days for their smolder than for the thing that actually made them a household name in the first place. The stone we're going to be discussing today is a steel composite of granodiorite, upon which is inscribed a decree issued on behalf of King Ptolemy V of Epiphanes, most likely on March the 27th of 196 BC. In layman's terms, the inscription basically reads, Pharaoh Ptolemy V of Epiphanes is hot shit. All these bitches trying to usurp the 13-year-old pharaoh ain't shit. If you think different, fuck around and find out. As compelling as succession skirmishes and power vacuums are, Game of Thrones-esque political nonsense is not, in fact, why we care about the Rosetta Stone today. What makes the stone interesting from an academic perspective is the fact that some poor sap drew the short straw of having to write the whole decree out 3 separate times. First, in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs at the top, next, in ancient Egyptian Demotic script in the middle, lastly, in ancient Greek at the bottom. So, we have a big rock with one decree written 3 times, each in a different language. No big deal. We only have, for the first time, since the use of hieroglyphs and Demotic script fell out of use in ancient Egypt, a basis for deciphering Egyptian scripts. It's like someone gave your boomer parents a reference guide for all those wacky acronyms the kids are using nowadays, and now they're excited because they can finally understand the text messages their children have been sending them. The Rosetta Stone, a big deal. A milestone, if you will, kind of discovery for archaeologists, anthropologists, and linguists alike at the time of its discovery. As the story goes, the stone was discovered on July 15th in 1799 by French officer Pierre-François Boucard during the Napoleonic campaign in Egypt near the town of Rashid, or Rosetta, at Fort Julian in the Nile Delta, while digging the foundations of an addition to the fort. This priceless artifact, that would go on to revolutionize our understanding of ancient Egypt itself, was being used as the foundation for an old building that was being rehabbed for the use of the French during their Egyptian campaign. This rock, that would eventually become the holy grail of items in academia, was about this close to being tossed away or repurposed for another building. But luckily, and not for the first time, or I guess the last time in history, mind you, the French would prove to actually be useful. Boucard recognized the significance of that stone in that moment and spared it such a mundane fate. The stone was taken away, and as is tradition, was eventually taken in possession of the British Museum upon the surrender of the French in 1801. To reiterate, since its initial carving to the point at which it was discovered by Boucard, the provenance of the Rosetta Stone is by no means set in stone until 1799. First off, there's the fact that the stone was found by the French in 1799, and then taken from them by the British following their historic surrender in 1801. So, does that mean that the stone actually belonged to the French, since they found it while occupying Egypt? But that's not how deep the rabbit hole truly goes. No, as I stated, the provenance of the Rosetta Stone before 1799 is rather sketchy. If we take into account where it was when it was found at Fort Julian, which was previously referred to as Fort Rashid, a fort that was originally built by the Ottoman Empire in about 1470, it's safe to say that it was actually the invasion of the Ottomans that put the stone where it was when it was found. So, does that make the stone the possession of the Ottomans, or the Turkish now today, since it was their fort the stone was being used in to begin with? We can go even further with this, to the very origin of the stone as being important, given the stone itself is a decree in service of Pharaoh Ptolemy V of Epiphanes, who, if you're not familiar with your Egyptian history, was a direct descendant of Lagus of Erodea, Macedon, as in Macedonia, Greek, a royal dynasty that formed following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. You know, the one who conquested all over the place in Western Asia and Egypt. So does that make the stone Greek then, since it was a declaration in service of a Greek Egyptian dynasty? Who's to say? Do you see yet why the whole conversation on Provenance is so complicated? There are like 3 other cultures aside from Egypt who could have a feasible argument for why the stone actually belongs to them if we just completely ignore Egypt. But let's broaden this conversation on provenance and preservation that we're having just a bit. What happens when it's not a case of changing cultures via invasion or imperialism or colonialism or what have you, but rather a shift in the culture and its values over time? At the center of the city of Rome in Italy, east of the Roman Forum, you can find the infamous Colosseum. Construction began under Emperor Vespasian in 72 AD, and in a time-honored tradition of city infrastructure projects taking for fucking ever, was not completed until 8 years later by his successor. The Colosseum, named the Flavian Amphitheater for the dynasty that commissioned its construction, could hold at least 12 Roman senators' massive throbbing ambitions, in addition to an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 spectators for a Saturday morning of bloody gladiator contests, animal abuses, executions, reenactments of famous battles, dramas based on Roman mythology based on Greek mythology, or, briefly, mock sea battles. The Colosseum is one of the largest amphitheaters ever built that still stands to this day, despite history's best efforts. Let me explain what I mean. You see, the spectator enjoyment of gratuitous violence would eventually fall out of fashion with the Roman public, and with it, the use of the Colosseum sometime around the early medieval era. It was then repurposed, most egregiously in the Middle Ages, as a quarry, with its masonry being carted off stone by stone for the building of other sacred, less loaded sites. Stones from the Colosseum were used in either the construction or repair of locations such as the Tribune of St. John Lateran Basilica in 1439, the Loggia of the Blessings in St. Peter's in 1462, the construction of the little chapel of Santa Maria della Pietà inside the Colosseum in 1519, the city walls, the Church of San Marco, the Palazzo Venezia during the 15th century, the Palazzo della Cancelleria, the Palazzo Farnese, the Palazzi Senatorio, and the De Conservatori on Capitol Hill in the 6th century, the Ponte Mio in 1574, and the Palazzo Bourbon in the 17th century. This continued until Pope Benedict XIV laid down the law during the mid-18th century and forbade further quarrying of the Colosseum, establishing the site as one of Christian martyrdom for the early Christians that had died there. Few minor repairs were made between 1751 and 1768, however, no significant restoration efforts were undertaken until the 21st century. In 2013, we saw the first stage of restoration of the site to its former glory set into motion, and currently, the top 2 levels of the Colosseum have been open for guided visits since November of 2017, which means that they're behind schedule. That's what that means. I mean, it only took 8 years to build the thing, but at the rate the restoration is going, it looks like the gladiatorial battles and executions won't be in full swing again until at least 2030. Where is the Italian enthusiasm for culture? Once again, we have a case in history where a stone, or in this case, stones of great significance, have been used in other building projects. However, unique to this case is the rendering of a sizable historical monument wholly incomplete. Restoring the monument to its original grandeur would necessitate removing parts from other historically significant monuments as a consequence, rendering them incomplete as well. So we kind of have a catch-22 here of sorts. No one, to my knowledge, is arguing for that sort of a restoration. But it is worth noting how fickle the pride of a culture about things with cultural significance can really be. To go from being a staple of imperial Roman life in antiquity to being reduced to nothing more than a resource of stone for other city projects, and then to be re-elevated to a sacred site for Christian martyrdom, and then to be reclassified as a tourist attraction, kind of gives one a little bit of whiplash. In essence, although we are talking about the same region in the world, we are not talking about the same people, much less the same culture. Everyone who was directly impacted by the Colosseum when it was being used for its original purpose has been dead for quite some time. The same is true about those who cared about using it for a quarry. The same is probably true about those who wanted to use it for Christian martyrdom, and in however many years, the same will be true for those who cared about using it as a tourist attraction. Things change, such as the nature of the beast we call culture, I'm afraid. And that's the thing that you have to contend with when you're making the argument, or any argument, centered on cultural appropriation, misappropriation, identity, etc. But I'm not done yet. Let's examine what happens when that cultural pride is flipped on its head near instantaneously by all-time standards. The year is 1966, when the great chairman Mao Zedong of the Great Chinese Communist Party launched the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution, following a period of great weak baby radical party members that had resulted in the great failure that was the Great Leap Forward, which resulted in the Great Chinese Famine from 1959 to 1961. The Great Mao was of a mind that the Great CCP needed to get back to basics, the heart of the issue, to recommit to the oh-so-great Mao Zedong thought, centered on the premise of preserving great Chinese communism through the systemic purging of all those not-so-great remnants of capitalism and other less-than-stellar traditional elements from the previously mediocre Chinese society. This recommitment to great Maoist thoughts looked a lot like calling upon the youth of China to rebel, forming in essence the Great Red Guard that would single-handedly enact 10 great years of violent struggles and chaos through their commitment to seizing power from institutions, embodying the lacking for olds, old subpar customs, old second-rate culture, old deficient habits, and old regrettable ideas. This not only resulted in the ransacking of homes, but the vandalization of cultural treasures, desecration of temples, the destruction of countless ancient buildings, artifacts, antiques, books, and paintings. Oh, sorry, that's footage of the Summer of Love, not the Great Cultural Revolution. Hang on a sec. Anyway, 30 of 80 cultural heritage sites and over 70% of cultural sites under Beijing protection were destroyed. Thousands of years of cultural history and tradition were effectively wiped from China's memory within those 10 years, snuffed out, along with the death and cannibalism of an untold number of Chinese citizens, both civilian and military. And what wasn't destroyed within the span of the 10 years of the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution was either very well hidden or smuggled abroad for sale. The Cultural Revolution lasted from 1966 until Mao Zedong's death in 1976, with much of the Maoist policies associated with the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution only being dismantled in December of 1978. Officially, the Chinese Communist Party didn't outright condemn all of the oopsies made in the name of greatness during this time until 1981, ceding the responsibility for the period of greatness squarely on Comrade Mao Zedong's shoulders. Not that he was really complaining at that point. However, they did grant their former leader some grace in diluting his part in the revolution by finger-pointing the root cause of the bulk of the turmoil at the manipulation of other counter-revolutionary groups instead. 5 years after the official condemnation of state-sanctioned cultural destruction, authorities in China would ironically begin a campaign to stop the smuggling of artifacts from China by Chinese people to Taiwan's National Palace Museum. So there's that. To emphasize, this is not an example much removed from our current timeline. The Great Cultural Revolution happened within the last 100 years, and the regime responsible for, let's be frank, a cultural holocaust is still in power today. Now, China is a country with a population of 1.412 billion people as of 2021. It's unlikely that there's been a complete cultural shift regarding traditions, so much so that these artifacts are rendered meaningless to all. In fact, we know that's not the case, as Chinese traditional artifacts being smuggled is so much of a problem that the State Administration of Cultural Heritage of China pledged to launch the largest national campaign against smuggling back in 2018. But as I said, we are less than 100 years removed from China's internal cultural holocaust. If the purpose of cultural artifacts is to be preserved so that we have a link to the past, to tradition, to heritage, so that we can learn more about them, is it not the responsibility of those who hold such a mindset to ensure their survival, whatever the cost, even if it's against the wishes of said culture, or members of said culture, I guess? And you know what? It might be that rampant cultural erasure is condemned officially by China, but let's not forget that the People's Republic of China have a proclivity, or has had a proclivity, still has a proclivity, towards curating their political image through the use of censorship, along with rampant human rights violations that include the genocide of Uyghur Muslims, genocide being the intentional destruction of a people. And what follows when you wipe out an entire population of people? Naturally, their culture tends to fade to nothing. So forgive me for not entrusting said culture who employs the use of underhanded tactics with significant cultural artifacts, as far as I can throw them. That seems irresponsible. Let me be clear. I don't mean that the smuggling shall continue until morale improves. No. I merely seek to impress upon the viewers the notion that the misappropriation of artifacts is not necessarily a net negative. It's a morally dubious position, I grant, but that side of the conversation is sorely lacking in spaces that whinge incessantly about colonialism and its utter devastation of the world that we know today. Oh. As with all things regarding history and its effect on the wider world, it's not a simple matter of black and white. Rather, it's gray. It's not simply good versus evil, and we are often prone to overlook that indisputable fact in hindsight, unfortunately. So I guess the real point of this video, dear viewer, is to assure you that there are worse fates for your cultural artifacts than having them end up in the hands of the British. See you next time.